Dystopia warning, obviously. Now today I'm going to be talking to you about the BBC. It's a story of perceived victimhood, media capture, power, control, and a relentless attempt to keep a grip on the narrative. To the right, the hard right especially, the BBC is a barrier, a hindrance, and a competitor. And as ever, the same set of opportunistic, morally bankrupt, hateful wangs are at the forefront. Look, I have my own beef with the BBC, don't get me wrong. I'm not defending it ideologically. For starters, the top of the BBC is like a Conservative Party conference at the one place in the world that never seems to blow up. I hate its continuous, obsessive platforming of reform. And don't even get me started on its deranged reaction to the Queen's death. I mean, what was that? They tracked her coffin for days like it was a Deliveroo order. Weeks of coverage that turned it from a news station into Mourn Hub. However, I can hold more than one thought in my head at the same time. And I know that it's broadly in our best interests to keep it. It's vast, it has some of the best journalists in the world, and is by and large accurate and trustworthy. My issue is the board that has been infiltrated by Tories and bad actors with vested interests who are destroying it from within. My other concern is us not ending up with a disparate, vulnerable, fragmented media landscape. So this video will be covering how people like Johnson, Farage, Trump are exploiting this for their own ends. How the Trump Panorama row shows the far-right playbook when it comes to trying to control reality. How the BBC has been infiltrated and softened by conservative insiders. And why dismantling the BBC will benefit billionaires, propagandists, conspiracy theorists with vested interests. Now at this point I could go into an explainer about what happened with Trump and the Panorama clip, about how it was spliced idiotically. I don't understand what they were thinking. This man is someone that has convinced his radicalised base that he is being targeted by the deep state, and someone who is notoriously litigious in implementing lawfare to undermine the media that holds him accountable. But if you want to see any form of balance or fairness towards Donald Trump, you're in the wrong place. If you want to see someone lick his arse, go watch Fox News. Because what's going on here is essentially an odious monster playing victim. Because regardless of whether or not the BBC spliced a clip, 10-second clip, that doesn't take away from the fact that he literally incited an insurrection. He committed treason. He did cause people to die. And that's not even the worst thing that he's done. He's sitting there on his golden throne like little Lord Roy, as the insurrectionists that he pardoned probably make up most of his masked Gestapo that are ripping people off the streets and bundling them into vans to disappear them with absolutely zero due process. So what makes him think that he deserves due process? Frankly, I have had it with populist right-wing figures who are literally the worst people in the world. People that refuse to play by the moral rule book that most decent people do, thinking that they somehow get to benefit from that rule book, while they spend their lives profiting from hate, treachery and deceit. This is a classic tactic of the populist right. Fake patriotism, conspiracy, pretend victimhood, and cover-ups. See, for Trump, this isn't even about one clip. Trump and his MAGA acolytes have spent years trying to convince their base that the media lies, that objective fact itself is a conspiracy against them. The same tactic used by authoritarians everywhere. Discredit the press, control the narrative. Because when people stop trusting the press, they cling to personalities. And once that happens, facts don't matter. They weaponize mistakes, go full Darvo, brand entire institutions as corrupt, while building propaganda outlets that they do control. Now, something that you would have seen everywhere is the laughable assertion that the BBC is left-wing. None of the evidence supports that. There is bias in the BBC, and there has been for some time, but it's not from the left. What has happened is the BBC has been essentially captured by the right at the very top. But the far right doesn't always even need to own the broadcaster. It just needs to install allies or influence oversight so that the output reflects or accommodates their agenda. And we have been seeing that with the hyper-normalisation of the far right across our media landscape. Just look at who is running the BBC at the very top. Tim Davie, the guy who resigned the other day, stood as a Tory candidate. He has been criticised multiple times for obvious right-wing bias, but no action has been taken against him. And you don't have to look very far to see why that might be the case. Enter Twatman, aka Robbie Gibb. Robbie Gibb was Theresa May's former Director of Communications, came from a news background. Not uncommon, particularly for a DOC. But what was maybe a little less common was the fact that Boris Johnson appointed him to the BBC board. That's akin to Gordon Brown appointing Alastair Campbell. Could you imagine the outcry? This is a man with a specific agenda, not least because he argued for the appointment of David Grossman, a friend of his who just so happens to share his worldview. He was asked to investigate complaints at the BBC, but only the ones that relate to left-wing bias. So the board has become broadly politicised by Gibb, and the newsroom of journalists are pressured by the top, people like Gibb, in terms of what they can actually report on. Then they pull in Michael Prescott, a so-called independent advisor, who just so happens to share the worldview of Gibb, the kind of worldview where he doesn't like the use of reproductive rights when it comes to talking about abortion, the kind of worldview where he relies on biased outlets like History Reclaimed in his references, people who push back on British imperialism and slavery. He is not an arbiter of neutral reporting. And to top it off, Robbie Gibb is one of the co-founders of GB News. Then of course there's Richard Sharp, the former chair of the BBC, who was forced to step down because it was revealed that he had helped to organise an 800 grand loan for Johnson whilst being appointed to the position. He was also a major donor to the Conservative Party. He was replaced by Samir Shah, again an advisor to the Conservative Party. And then you've seen people like Farage and Johnson calling out the supposed bias of the BBC. Johnson didn't mind it when footage was edited to show him in a favourable light, though, did he? Like in 2019 during a leaders' debate when laughter in reaction to a question asked of Johnson was removed by the BBC. Or when footage of him laying a wreath upside down in 2019, just before the election again, was replaced with footage from 2016. What about when he attended the Jubilee and they overlaid later footage of him arriving to lessen the boos?
Quite booing in the crowd there.
Well, and you can hear it. There is really quite a lot of booing, actually.
Wow.
Now, because he has absolutely no shame, Johnson keeps thinking that we are entitled to hear his ridiculous opinion. A man that worked for the tabloid press and then decided to have a go at running the government because this is how rich toffs operate. And now that he's fucked that up, he's gone back to writing for the Mail. Does he forget the way that BBC flagship political programmes constantly pandered to his perspective and the Tory party broadly? This is Laura Kuenssberg basically towing the Conservative Party line before the Tory budget.
Wednesday might not be a vintage day. Maybe there won't be much fairy dust because the country's balance sheet was battered by COVID and then the conflict in Ukraine. So it will not be a moment when the Chancellor will have many tasty morsels to tempt you with.
Compare this to how Labour's budget is being covered in the news. Oh yeah, and you can't forget the time that she almost wet her pants at the mere sight of Boris Johnson.
Deal for the people of this country.
Boris,
Look, how did you go, Laura?
quite close colleagues of yours.
What about the fact that under Gibb and Davey, a Byline Times investigation found that BBC bosses drew up a plan to win over reform voters directly by changing story selection and output types, including drama, to directly appeal to the reform base. Not just that, the overrepresentation of reform politicians. Byline also flagged that reform politicians were featured heavily on BBC flagship programmes, despite having relatively few MPs. This is direct evidence of audience targeting, rather than impartial news strategy under Tim Davie and Robbie Gibb. That's before you even get on to the piece from Yorkshire Bylines regarding Question Time coverage, who studied 352 broadcasts from September 2014 to July 2023. They found that the 5 most regular non-political guests all came from the right, and Farage appeared over 38 times, despite Reform UK having 5 MPs. This supports the idea that the BBC has been giving extra spotlight to Reform's politicians, and from January to July 2025, the BBC's News at 10 referred to Reform UK in approximately a quarter of bulletins, more than the Lib Dems despite them having more MPs. So, why do people like Farage and Johnson and Trump want the BBC defunded and gone? Why do newspapers like the Telegraph or the Daily Mail want the BBC gone? And most importantly, how would that affect us politically? Well, I'm going to tell you. Public service broadcasting prevents market capture. It's publicly funded, so a billionaire can't buy it or influence it. Well, not entirely. Now, politicians like Farage, Johnson the increasingly mental Tories, they want full control privately and fully aligned ideologically. They essentially want another propaganda outlet, but they prefer it when it comes with a veil of perceived respectability, especially when it's a broadcaster that the public trusts, like they overwhelmingly do with the BBC. So that is being eroded by the constant attacks on the BBC and astroturfing online via foreign bot farms that are pushing again that manufactured agenda and the illusion of mass consensus. And of course it's a competitor and has a vast platform, the likes of which the Telegraph, the Mail, the Sun, other hacks could only ever dream of. If the BBC falls, the gap gets filled. And no, I'm not referring to any woman that Johnson inexplicably fucks. But that gap does not get filled with honesty. No, quite the opposite. It makes us vulnerable to the agenda of the people that are funding Farage, Trump, who are incidentally the worst people in the world. The BBC actually blocks their propaganda pipeline. Culture war instigators rely on constant outrage. That's why they're all over social media, which has absolutely none of the checks and balances and regulations of the BBC. And they use that to embed their narrative, i.e. invasions, small boats. And the BBC slows this down with fact-checking, context, balance, respected journalism. So once people stop trusting institutions with a proven track record of reporting facts, well, they can be sold anything, can't they? From conspiracy to nationalism to full-blown authoritarianism. And why is that sense of shared reality? And I'm not talking in the North Korean sense, I'm just talking about objective fact and reality, like scientific data. And that gets eroded. You have people defending and believing anything. The BBC is a part of our British defence against that. And crucially, it's something that the US lacks. Now, John Burns Murdoch did a really important thread on this in 2023. In that thread, he outlined how culture war politics needs a fragmented sense of reality, fragmented media landscape. Inflammatory, polarising rhetoric thrives in countries where people do not share a common source of information. The US has no shared news source. Britain does. In the UK, around 60% of people use the BBC as a news source. The BBC's rated high on trust and consumption, though unfortunately that's decreased since 2023 due to the campaigns that I've talked about. But even when it's criticised, it's broadly trusted across party lines. And it interestingly found that partisan players like GB News, Talk TV, etc. don't have the power that their US equivalents do, i.e. GB News versus Fox News. Fox is rated as highly trusted amongst Republicans, but GB News has weak trust amongst Conservatives in Britain. So if the BBC is weakened, the UK loses that centre of gravity. And that's how you know that them weakening the BBC is about power and control. Because it reaches so many people, there's a common foundation of fact. And if the centre collapses, you don't get more trust and less bias, more balance, more impartiality. You get influence sold off to the highest bidder. And there are plenty of people willing to exploit that. And there are people here linked to the Conservative Party, linked to people like Gibb, Tim Davie, Donald Trump, who are helping this to happen. Namely Michael Prescott, that mate of Gibb who I mentioned earlier. You know, the guy behind that bias memo that was leaked to the press. Well, he built his career at Hanover Communications, a major lobbying firm, whose client list includes US tech giants with long-standing political and financial links to Donald Trump. We're talking companies like Oracle, instrumental to Trump's political messaging. They aren't random tech companies. They're a part of the American conservative influence infrastructure. The donor circles, the people who bankrolled Trump's campaign. This was the guy that was brought in by Gibb to the BBC's editorial guidelines and standards committee. His memo pushed claims of systematic progressive bias, using examples that Byline Times found to be selectively chosen, ideologically aligned, or drawn from right-wing think tanks presented as neutral experts. And this is the transatlantic far-right media strategy in action. And what is that strategy? Undermine trust in a publicly owned broadcaster, insert partisan actors into its infrastructure and oversight board, pressure it to adopt strategies, narratives, corrections aligned with conservative political goals, and use any slip up, no matter how minor, like the 10-second splicing clip, and paint it as evidence of corruption or sabotage, while solely focusing on bias that's virtually non-existent towards the other side the left. These people don't need to own the BBC. They just need to shape its internal governance. Just enough so the public loses confidence in it. And if the BBC becomes seen as broken or untrustworthy, Farage, the billionaire press, and the US far-right media ecosystem get exactly what they want. A weakened institution, a deeply fragmented and malleable media landscape in which all manner of bastards can slip in their own agenda, and a public that is primed to be controlled and misinformed with outrage-driven propaganda. Basically, our news environment ends up like fucking Twitter nowadays, which is akin to a Nazi rally. And this isn't just a BBC story. This is what we are seeing everywhere. It's chapter and verse from the international far-right playbook. Truth itself gets sold off to the highest bidder. You can't build an authoritarian political landscape if a population still shares a common foundation of facts. And what could be the outcome? Chaos, disorder, unrest. If you don't have a fair press, then you don't have a democracy anymore. Because how on earth do you make informed political decisions without it? So when you look at this in the grand scheme of things, this is bigger than just a media fight. This isn't about loving and supporting everything that the BBC is. It's about fighting for what it represents and stopping foreign funded institutions and networks from shaping our sense of British identity and our reality. That's patriotism, not hanging a limp flag off a fucking lamppost. Thought they all hated foreigners. Well, if they had it their way and the BBC was defunded, the foreigners would literally be controlling what we think. And if you like what I do, please click subscribe. You're bellend.